Hi, everybody. This is Dan and Brendan again, and talking about current events, legal issues of interest in the current environment. And I don't know, Dan. I get the sense that President Trump has been on a tear since he got into office. He's one of his projects seems to be to dismantle any guardrails around the presidency. Certainly while he's president. And it seems to me that he's using this pandemic as an opportunity really to do that. I mean, it seems like every Friday night we hear about another inspector general. Friday night, of course, being the news dump, preference, right, for this White House, because they're figuring between the pandemic and it being Friday night, nobody's going to notice that they're getting rid of all these inspectors general. Who are
the news cycle goes down over the weekend. Nobody's paying attention. And so by the time Monday rolls around, nobody cares anymore. It's just the latest Trump misdeed du jour.
Right. Plus, collectively as a nation, we have the attention span of a goldfish. That helps as well. So,
sure.
Enough of that. Let's talk legally. What's going on here. There are serious questions now about any check on presidential power. Does it within the executive branch? Because again, these were the watchdogs. These inspectors general in these various departments are the people who are supposed to be the watchdogs to make sure that everything's on the up and up. There's no corruption going on. So you have some oversight from within, and then of course you have Congress trying to exercise oversight. At least the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, trying to exercise oversight, while the Republicans in the Senate basically. Mitch McConnell does his Mitch McConnell imitation and goes along with anything that Donald Trump wants to do. So I'm probably coming across as too cynical and sounding downtrodden about this. But
I think you're coming across as pretty much right on point. So
all right. Well, why don't you give us, we were talking before we started here, you did a great job sort of laying out the legal principles and constitutional principles that are in play, plus the two different views you discuss about executive power. So I'm just going to throw it over to you and let you run with that.
Sure. So let's see if we can sort of situate ourselves here constitutionally and figure out where all of this belongs. We all know from our fond memories of 7th grade civics class that our government is composed of three branches. There's the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. They are three co-equal branches, which means they are all, in terms of power and authority, sort of on the same level playing field. And we've talked before about the interplay between the branches, separation of powers, how the branches relate to one another, and so forth. And we did that quite recently, in fact, in connection with our discussion of subpoenas for Trump's tax returns. That is, at least as far as the congressional subpoena is concerned, that's simply an instance of Congress trying to exercise its oversight power to supervise and, in some sense, regulate the activity of the executive branch. So what we're really talking about here are what we might call structural issues, the structural interrelationships between the three branches, or for purposes of our discussion more particularly, between the legislative branch and the executive branch. As a sort of historical matter, it has never really seriously been questioned that Congress has the authority to exercise at least some degree of supervision and oversight of the president. And this is another subject that we've talked about before when we talked about the Youngstown case and the separation of powers issues that's involved there. How do we know if the president has the authority to do X? Well, we ask ourselves, has Congress authorized the president to do X? If so, then as long as the president acts within the scope of that authority, the president is good to go. So the whole Youngstown three categories thing that we talked about is an example of Congress exercising what has been well understood as historical powers of oversight and control of the president. Now, obviously, because Congress and the president are supposed to be co-equal branches, there are questions as to how far Congress can go in exercising that oversight. But in any event, that's the idea, and it's well accepted historically, again, that Congress has some authority to exercise oversight and to regulate the activities of the president is one view of the interrelationship between Congress and the presidency and the exercise of presidential powers. A second view that has developed sort of robustly, if you will, over the last, I don't know, 3-4 decades, is what we sometimes call the unitary theory of the executive. The unitary theory of the executive, again, is something that has sort of caught on rather robustly, especially within the last 3 to 4 decades, but more particularly since the Bush administration and now into the Trump administration. The unitary executive theory holds that the president must have complete and unfettered control over all executive officers. So, on the unitary theory, when President Trump says, I don't like the inspector general who is serving at the State Department for whatever reason, the president can say, you are out, and Congress, under the unitary executive theory, has absolutely nothing to say about that idea. Now, we might ask ourselves, and this is probably a discussion for another day, but we might fairly ask ourselves whether the Trump administration has carried the unitary executive theory well beyond any boundaries that have to this point been understood. Because in President Trump's mind, not only does the unitary executive theory hold, but he is completely unaccountable to anyone at all, save perhaps the voters. And I'm not sure that I would even concede that he would agree with that. So those are the competing theories. Theory number one, Congress has the authority to exercise some degree of supervision and control over the presidency. And that is brought to life by cases like Youngstown. The second theory is the unitary executive theory. And that's brought to life by cases. There's a well-known case called Morrison against Olson that discusses the unitary executive theory in considerable detail.
Yeah, that's that's a great backdrop for the conversation. I mean, when trying to understand separation of powers, I think the way to look at it is Congress is supposed to make law, the president's supposed to execute the law, courts are supposed to interpret and apply the law in individual cases. Nobody's suggesting that Congress can tell the president how to execute the law any more than the president can tell Congress what laws to make. But Congress makes the laws that the president is supposed to be executing. So there is necessarily an interrelationship between the two. And one of the things I was thinking about while you were laying that out is one question is what textually in the Constitution is required in terms of the separation or the roles of each one of these branches. And another question is what history has taught us over time. And although this theory of this unitary executive theory, let's concede that as a textual matter, the president is the chief executive and probably would be the chief law enforcement officer in the country. That textual concession, if you will, doesn't deal with things we learned through the Nixon administration and other presidential administrations about the wisdom of separating the Department of Justice from the White House. And sometimes I think that we listen to people, they're falling back on sort of philosophical textual arguments without any historical context or without considering the wisdom, right, of having a president who is totally unsupervised, especially one like this, who I'm sorry is the most childlike president probably in the history of the United States, who needs adult supervision.
Correct.
And so you know, I'll leave off with this. We only have a couple minutes, but then I'll throw it back to you to see what you think about this. I just think all the time, Barack Obama, when he was president, uh, it, Hillary Clinton was under investigation by Barack Obama's FBI. The way things are developing now, right, he would have been completely within the proper bounds of his office to fire anybody in the FBI or the Department of Justice who was investigating Hillary Clinton in the course of a presidential election, and to do so unapologetically. But the fact is that as that was going on, the thought, I think you and I talked about it, the thought that Barack Obama would interfere in an ongoing investigation at the Department of Justice by FBI agents was absolutely unthinkable. It would have been the scandal of the century up to that point. But now we live in a world where it happens every week.
No question. And what you just described, the sort of interplay, if you will, between constitutional text and what might we call it, political wisdom or the teachings of history, that I think is sort of distilled down into this idea that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and that is what we're talking about here is a structural concept.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about then is simply a structural issue. The text is not so specific as to give us concrete guidance in every one of these instances. The framers, though, well understood the dangers of an out of control executive. And the system that they created and that we use today is premised upon this fundamental idea, and I think we can probably leave it here. Our constitutional system depends for its survival, for its function, for its effectiveness on the good faith of the people who are charged with operating it. If that good faith is absent, then there simply is no way that the system can function the way that it was intended to function. And that, I fear, is where we find ourselves today.
Right. Well, my friend, we are out of time, but another great discussion. We probably need to do another video on this because there's more to say, but I think that lays a good foundation for any future discussions we have about this. So thank you so much, and we'll be back soon to discuss more.
See you, everybody.